So what we're going to do is to look at introductory aspects of research, whether it is advertising, public relations, or any aspect of social sciences. Research process is similar in all these areas. So we're going to look at the basics of research, and then you apply it to advertising and public relations. What is research? Research is a systematic way of finding solutions to an identified problem. That's the basic way of defining research. Research is problem-driven. So there has to be a problem for research to be meaningful. In fact, research cannot even take place in the first place without a problem statement, without a problem, a clearly defined problem. So research is scientific. It is systematic. That is to say, it is a systematic way of providing solutions to a problem. So research is a systematic investigation of a problem you want to tackle. That is research. So research is empirical. When we say research is empirical, it means that research is based on proven scientific methods from real observation. It's not just hearsay, or you just say that you observed this and then you saw that and conclude that this is the result. No, there has to be a systematic way of going after the problem bit by bit, identifying the cause of the situation, and then coming up with probable solutions to the problem. So research is a systematic investigation of a problem. The problem could be a situation, it could be a business, it could be something about the market, it could be anything that has to do with challenge, it could be about behavior or whatever. But the fact is that research is problem driven. Research can be categorized in various ways. You can have qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research uses non-numerical data to analyze a situation and come up with solutions. That is to say, it deals with words, feelings, emotions, and such other non-numerical elements. That is to say, you just describe what you're seeing without figures. That's what we mean by non-numerical. You rarely use figures to, describe what you are doing. You don't use percentages. You don't try to do calculations and that. It is called qualitative research. You build your observations based on explanations, written explanations. Then you can have quantitative research. This one is based on analysis of numerical data. That is, you go to the field, you study a situation, and then you come up with figures that will help understand the situation and then provide solutions. This is the kind of research where you have calculations, percentages, tables, and all that. That is quantitative research. Research can also be basic or applied. Now, if it is basic research, it is done for the sake of knowledge. That is, you want to understand the situation. You want to get basic knowledge, know something about a situation, know something about a problem. But if it is applied research, you are not doing it for knowledge's sake, but you are doing it to apply it to a practical situation. That is to say, research that is used to solve a problem in a company. Maybe the products of a company are not doing well in the market, and you want to do research to find out how you can improve on the sales of that product. That's applied research. But if you want to do a research to understand what really happens in the market, what it means for consumers to be brand loyal, you can do basic research just to get knowledge about a situation. Maybe you want to understand why people in a particular village behave in a specific way. You can just do basic research and then understand that scenario. But if it is applied research, then you want to solve a problem in that village, apply it to that problem in that village. Research can also be exploratory, descriptive, experimental, case study, longitudinal, or correlational. That is the one they call causal research too. Now, if it is exploratory research, you're talking about research done for the first time on a situation to get basic knowledge on a specific problem. That's what we call exploratory research. You are trying to explore to get knowledge that others can use in doing further research on that particular situation. Then if it is descriptive research, you are trying to describe a phenomenon. You are trying to describe a population. You are trying to get their characteristics. You are more concerned with what and not basically how or why. It's an attempt to describe or identify what is and not necessarily why it is that way or how it came to be that way. An example is a study on an analysis of newspaper readers in a particular city or state or maybe country. You just want to know who they are, their age bracket, the number of hours in a day they put into reading newspapers. That is to say, you just want to describe the kind of newspaper readers in a particular study area. That's descriptive study. Then if it's experimental research, then you're talking about having two variables and then you manipulate one variable to see how it affects the other. So this is experimental research. It's a kind of controlled research where you manipulate one variable to see how it affects the other. Then you have case studies. Case studies, this is also a type of research. This one looks at a single case over a period of time to provide detailed real-time account of what happened and then how a particular problem could be solved. When we say case study, you could case study individuals or an individual, you could case study an organization, you could case study a situation. That is to say, you are looking at this particular problem, maybe something that happened in a company, maybe in public relations, for instance, it could be about crisis that erupted in a particular company. You case study that company, follow it from the beginning to the end, when the crisis started, how it happened, at the end of the day, how it was solved. That's a case study. You bring out the problems and the solutions to that particular case. Maybe you want to study children, how they develop reading habits through media exposure. You can watch the kids from the age of 2 to the age of 5. That's also a case study. This also takes us to the next kind of research we call longitudinal research. Longitudinal research is the one that is done over time. Over time. Just like the example I gave under case study research, longitudinal research, you can watch a particular situation over time. In the Western world, they do a lot of longitudinal research that they watch a particular situation, phenomenon, or a particular challenge. They watch it over time to see what develops. Of course, you have correlational or causal research, the one that looks at relationship between two variables. Correlational research. So what we're trying to do is to present to you just the basics of research, mention them. Of course, you can read further, but now you know that there is exploratory, descriptive, experimental, case studies, longitudinal research, and correlational or causal research. Now, these are types of research. It's different from types of research methods. How do you now go about carrying out the study? What are the basic steps you're going to take in the field to arrive at a solution to the problem you set out to solve? And that is where you have method of carrying out the research. The one you have survey method, content analysis method, focus group discussion method, interview method, and library research method. That's also historical method. So you see, types of research is different from types of research method. So now, let's look at functions of research. Let's just mention them. Functions of research. If you are engaged in any aspect of communication research, what's the essence of research in that aspect of communication? Whether it is advertising or public relations research, media research, you have basic functions of research. Then you apply it to the specific area you're carrying out the research on. We have basic functions. The first function is that research is used to solve problems. Of course, we said that research is problem driven. So the basic thing is that you carry out research because you want to solve problem, and the problem has to be clearly defined. Otherwise, you'll be wasting your time in the field. In fact, there won't even be research in the first place if the problem is not clearly stated. So every other function of research is derived from this basic one, which is to solve problem. For instance, research is used to explore new areas. You want to know how things happen in a particular way, or how people behave in a particular way. That you can carry out what we called earlier exploratory research, just to get basic knowledge of how people behave in a particular way. Maybe why people don't watch television late in a particular city, or why a particular class of people don't read newspapers. So you can carry out such research to get basic knowledge which other people could use in further studies. Research provides facts for planning. If it is advertising, public relations, in any organization, what research does is to provide facts that you're going to use to plan how you can run your company, to plan how you can make things work, to plan how you can achieve your objectives, to plan how you set your goals. So research, if for instance, you are running a television company, you want to do audience research to find out what the audience like about night television, what kind of night programs audience like, the time during the day they watch television, so that you know the kind of programs you're going to set in for them. And then, of course, the nature of the audience, you want to find out what are the classes of audience, so that you also make your programs to suit the audience. In anything you're doing, the first step is to plan. The first step is to plan. And how do you plan? First step is to research, get facts that you're going to use to set goals for yourself. Then research is used in information gathering, collection of data. To gather information on a particular problem or particular phenomenon you want to study, you need to do research. So research is used for information gathering, data collection, data you're going to use to solve problems, to take care of situations, to explain how people behave in a particular way. That is if, for instance, that's the kind of research you want to do. So research is basically for problem solving, for fact finding, to explore new areas, provide facts for planning. Of course, research helps companies to save funds because you don't just move into the market without understanding how the market behaves. You don't even begin a business without understanding the market behavior. So research helps you to save funds. So if you keep breaking down these things, you will understand that the basic thing is that research is used for fact finding and the facts are used to solve problems. Research is used to understand the relationship between variables. In fact, researchers set out to measure variables, to check variables, to assess variables. So what is a variable? A variable is something that changes or is likely to change. That's what they call variable. Variables are measured in the field by researchers. A variable could be a person, a thing, a place, or situation that is likely to change. Now, we call them variables because you are trying to monitor them, to assess them, to see why they change, what makes them dynamic, what makes them take a particular turn or take a particular shape instead of the other. That's why they call them variable. For instance, exposure to television. Exposure is a variable because people don't watch television the same time, the same number of hours, the same day, the same way. They don't even like the same programs. So exposure is a variable. So if you want to do a study in communication and you want to check exposure to television and its influence on academic performance, it means that exposure is a variable because you want to check whether the number of hours they put into TV or whether watching TV in the first place influences their academic performance. So academic performance is also a variable because it means their grades change. Maybe they were having 60 or 70 before, suddenly they are beginning to have 30%, 40% as scores after tests. So academic performance changes. That is why you call it a variable. Exposure changes. But then there is what we call dependent and independent variable. Now, academic performance depends on exposure to television in this particular case because you are checking whether the way they watch television influences their performance in class. So the way they watch television is independent variable because it is on its own. It is what you're going to use to check whether the other one is being affected. So anytime you are doing a study and you have two variables and you want to see how one affects the other or how one influences the other, the one that you are checking whether it influences the other is the one they call independent variable. But the one you want to see whether it is influenced, whether it is going to be affected, is the one you call dependent variable. So you have dependent and independent variable. Of course, it's not all studies that you have two variables. If you could do a study and you have only one variable, you call it univariate study. That is what you call univariate study. For instance, somebody in communication could do a study on newspaper readership behavior of students in Lagos State or radio listening habits of civil servants in Edo State. That's a univariate study. You're only looking at radio listening habit. That is what changes. The other one, you are only looking at newspaper readership, how they read newspapers. That's just one variable. But if you say influence of Picnic advertising on patronage of the brand, that is, you want to study whether it is Picnic advert that makes people to buy the product, maybe because they watch Picnic advert on TV, they see the billboard or they listen to the advert on radio, maybe it now makes them to buy the product. So in this case, you have two variables. You have Picnic advertising because the advert could change. If you put in small money and then you have fewer number of slots on radio, that's different from someone who puts in much money and has higher number of slots. Maybe the advert will run for like 10 times on a particular station in a day, but somebody else could do the advert, maybe run 2 times. So Picnic advertising is a variable. Somebody could also do the advert on radio and TV and billboard, so it's a variable. And then patronage of the product, that is to say whether people buy or not, is also a variable because that changes. So when you have two variables, it is called bivariate study. Bivariate study. Of course, there are times you can have more than two variables. That one is called multivariate study. multivariate study. For instance, look at this topic. Knowledge, awareness, and practice of hand washing among residents of Awka. Now you have three variables here, so it's multivariate study. Knowledge, do they know about hand washing? What is even hand washing? Do they know about it? Awareness, are they aware of the campaign you want to study? Are they even exposed to it? Do they even know that the campaign on hand washing is existing? And then practice. Okay, maybe they know about hand washing. They know what it's all about. Awareness, maybe they know about, they are aware of the campaign on radio, TV, and then do they practice in the first place? You have three variables you're looking at here. That is a multivariate study. So that's what we mean when we talk about variables in a study. Remember we said that research is problem driven. So we want to emphasize identification of research problem. How do you identify research problem? How do you formulate research problem? So let's look at this. First of all, research problem is a difficulty or deficiency to be overcome. So you check whether there's a difficulty or a deficiency to be overcome in a particular company or a particular situation. That could be how you identify a situation that requires research. It could be that the products are no longer moving in the market. You don't even understand whether television advertising is helping your company. Maybe you want to check whether it is social media advert. Maybe advert on Snapchat, advert on TikTok, advert on blogs, advert on WhatsApp. Maybe those are the ones that will drive your company sales. So you don't understand. Then that's a problem. Maybe the deficiency is that workers are no longer showing dedication to their job the way they used to or the way they're supposed to. So this is something you want to understand. Then you can look at a condition to be improved upon. Remember I said that you can have a positive problem or a negative problem. So when you see a condition that could be improved upon, maybe the condition is not negative, you want to improve upon it, and that is positive problem. This thing is working out fine, so you want to improve upon it, and that could be how you get research problem. Then gap in knowledge. Gap in knowledge. This one has to do with maybe academic research. There's a gap in knowledge. Maybe people understand that the mass media influence people's buying behavior, but maybe there are no studies on whether social media, especially TikTok or Snapchat, whether they influence how people purchase products. That's a gap in knowledge. So gap in knowledge is the missing portion of a particular study area. What is missing in this particular area? They've been doing studies on newspaper coverage of this event, newspaper coverage of that disaster, but there is an aspect of the society that nobody has done a study to check how newspapers cover that area. That's a gap in knowledge. So once you identify such situation, that's a research problem. You now go out to study that problem. Then you could have a theory that requires further understanding. There are several theories out there. People have different theories in communication. You have agenda setting theory, you have uses and gratification theory, symbolic interaction theory, technological determinism theory, a lot of theories out there. So, but you could want to understand one better, or you think that this theory is defective, or you think that the theory needs to be expanded. That could be a research problem. That way, you have identified a problem, and then you set out to do a study that will help you either to enhance the understanding of that theory or even to add to it. You can also identify a research problem by looking at views held in different parts of the world which require validation in your own area. That is to say, views held in different parts of the world, whether they apply to your own area, maybe your own village or your own city or your own state or your own country. That is to say, you want to localize a study that has been done in the Western world. See whether that same thing applies in Nigeria or applies in a particular region in Nigeria. For instance, they've done studies abroad on the information-seeking behavior of diabetes patients in the US. Maybe they have results about the Western world, how it happens in the Western world, and you want to see how that happens in Nigeria. That's a research problem. You now localize it. So you can look at studies done in different parts of the world, find out the views they had about such studies, and then you localize it to your own area. You can say, let me replicate this study done in the Western world or done in a particular state, even in your country. Maybe a study that has been done on people in Edo State. You want to now do the study on people in Kaduna State to see whether it's the same situation. You can identify a problem by looking at views that are held about situations in different places to see whether they apply in your own area, your own locality, or your own study environment. From the research problem, you now carve out objectives that will help to solve that problem, that will help lead you into the field to at least know how to exactly gather data to solve those problems of course, you turn those objectives into questions. Those questions are the specific research questions you ask in the field to generate data. Research each step is a process, and this process has steps. So there are basic steps in research. Basic steps in research. The first thing you do is you identify the problem. We said the problem is the basic thing in research. Without a problem, there's no research in the first place. There's no need for research. Otherwise, you'll be wasting money. So you identify a problem. Next step is that you review literature in that area to see what others have done. To see what others have done in that area. That's why we review literature. Then to see whether there's a gap, so that you don't go and then repeat what others have done without making any impact. You review literature in that area, then you clarify the problem. Next step, the third step, is you clarify the problem. Then you be sure that you have set out a clearer problem, because from the literature you've reviewed, you will get facts with which to work, with which to polish your problem statement. Then you define the terms and concepts of the study. If, for instance, you are looking at, maybe you're studying newspaper readership habit of students in Nnamdi Azikiwe University. So if you want to define students operationally, you will refer to student as any person studying in Nnamdi Azikiwe University. So operational definition of student in your work will now be any person studying in Nnamdi Azikiwe University. So what you do is you narrow down your definitions to your study area or the sample you're studying or the specific programs you're using for study, depending on the word you want to define. So you define the terms, then you come up with methodology. That is to say, how you're going to carry out the study. Under methodology, you have the method of study. Are you using survey method? Are you using content analysis method? Is it going to be focus group discussion method that you're going to use? Under methodology, that's where you give the population of your study, the sample size you're going to study, then the sampling technique you're going to use, of course, the instrument that you're going to use, which is dependent on the method of study. If, for instance, you're using survey method, then you could use the questionnaire instrument to get your data. And then the next step is to collect data from the field. After collecting data from the field, the next step is to analyze data and then draw your conclusions and provide recommendations. So it's a straight way to carrying out research. You follow these steps and then you will carry out your research, whether it's in advertising or public relations, or even any other aspect of communication research. You can use this process to do a good job.